And so some have advocated the idea of at least trying to relearn or figure out how to integrate livestock into cropping systems. And there's been quite a bit of research on this and focused on things like cattle, sheep, and goats and how they can be used to um, capitalize on some of the residues left in field crops. And I think that there's a lot of exciting work going on out there. But as our group found, there hasn't been as much research thinking about poultry and how integrating poultry can actually also have a lot of advantages, especially for smaller farmers that may not have the acreage to actually have a herd of cattle or to have a large scale integrated system. In poultry, there's a lot of flexibility in how large or small your operation can be that might help match vegetable production. And so Arlene and Ajay and Maurice really led the way in conducting a survey of growers to ask them what they believe the benefits of integrating poultry into vegetable cropping systems was. And the top four things that they highlighted were healthy, better health for poultry, improved soil quality and egg quality, and also the reduction of costs for inputs, especially when you think about fertility inputs. And so with this talk, I really want to hone in and try to focus on some of those aspects. And so many of you are probably very familiar with how farmers might integrate, but for some of you that are less familiar, there's actually a lot of different strategies. And they can be broken down into kind of three different groups. A farm might have spatially segregated integration where the livestock, or in this case poultry, never really cross paths with the vegetables. And this, some people don't really necessarily think this is integration, but there is still a utility of using vegetable residues for poultry or manure from the poultry because they're in close proximity. Rotational integration is when you use the same plot of land and have poultry on pastures and then integrate later on plant vegetables. And so you're separating them in time, but not in space. They're on the same field. And some people do fully combined integration, which is where you might actually have both vegetables and poultry on the same fields. Although for a vegetable grower, that's probably very uncommon actually because of food safety and that poultry will actually eat the vegetables. But for things like orchards or vineyards or other kinds of agroforestry or tree crop type plantings, there are a number of growers that are very interested in integrating in that type of form. But today we'll, again, just be focusing on this rotational integration strategy. And so what this looks like in time is you might think of a farmer establishing a pasture, and this could be for a whole season or a whole year, or for a short-term period, like over establishing a summer cover crop and utilizing that as a pasture and introducing poultry onto that pasture where they go around eating those crops, the cover crops or pasture plants. And then in the following season, planting vegetables. So there's a lot of flexibility here in how people do it and or the length of time between these segments. Some people might run multiple batches of poultry on the same pasture. Others might actually just utilize the crop residues after they've harvested them to go ahead and put the poultry on those fields and capitalize on those resources. There's also a lot of different ways people actually manage those poultry in these fields. A lot of layers are raised under makeshift chicken tractors or different kind of hoop pens, and the birds actually are open to forage outside of those across a certain area that's usually fenced in with an electrical fence. And this allows the poultry to have a lot of access and also move around. A common strategy for broilers may be to actually limit them to just the confinement of the pull pen or the chicken tractor themselves, because they're relatively short-lived, and from 6 to 12 weeks of time. And then instead of keeping that stationary, moving that pen around the pasture allows them to gain access to new pasture throughout the course of their life. And if you're interested, we utilize this extension publication from Kentucky State University as well as the University of Kentucky. That's pretty easy and low budget to make, where it's really a cattle panel hooped over and secured to wood or metal and has a wood frame. And back in 2012, it cost $200, but it may be about double that after COVID for those materials. And so you can also utilize things like wheels to help these move. And here's actually an image of Victor Helmos, and there's Karina and Kentima working to keep those chickens fair. But you like to use a dolly to pick up one end that can help you pull it much quicker. Other farmers have scaled this up to use this kind of large scale. It's basically a high tunnel that has had some supports strewn throughout it. And this is from Root Barn Farm. This is Ben Abel's system here, and hopefully in the near future, he might be a speaker for our series. But this allows you to increase the number of birds per tractor substantially and cover more area. Okay, so what I really wanted to talk about today was what can you do to really improve the benefits of integration for the crops that are going to follow your poultry. And I think there's two things that can be useful to consider, and I'll focus quite a bit on the last part because that's where our research is focused. The first one is just managing the manure deposition and trying to maintain more of an even distribution of that manure. And the second is just finding the right density of poultry. And we'll share some results from our research that at least gives somewhat of a bar that might benefit crop yield. So managing the manure deposition is quite easy if you're using a pen that confines the birds within it, because then basically every time you move the pen, if you move that in a consistent pattern, the manure deposition will follow the pattern of where you move the pen. And so in this case, there's 16 locations where this pen would move. They'll roughly receive a similar amount, except that as the birds age, they'll get larger and deposit more manure towards the end of the life cycle. But that can be different compared to more of a free range type system where the birds are out foraging. You'll probably see higher manure deposition near the location of their pen or their chicken tractor, and maybe places like where the feeders are located. But you may see less deposition in areas further away. And so you may have uneven manure deposition across your pasture, which will become the planting area for your field later on. And so what I really want to focus on is more of this idea of these broiler chicken systems where the chickens are housed within a closed pen that prevents them from leaving the pen, because that's more of a common system that I've seen in some of my area. And so I think one key thing for the second part is what is the right density to have on your fields of poultry to have enough manure deposited. And This is something that I've had a few questions about and wanted to make sure I have very clear instructions about how you might actually calculate the density that you have. And so let me know if this works, because this is kind of a new idea, a simple but newer idea of how to think about this. Because it's quite challenging in this rotational grazing system to think about the total area your birds are occupying. And so to really calculate this poultry density, all you need is the size of your pen. If they're maintained within that pen, um, you can that it can be very helpful to estimate this. So here, if you have a 20 by 50-foot high tunnel pen, that's 1,000 feet squared. Um, you need to know how many times you move the pen. So maybe you brood your chickens for 3 weeks and then they're out on pasture for 4 weeks. And if you move the pen every day, that would be 28 movements. So with this two data together, you know the area total of pasture that those birds occupied. And then the last bit is just the number of birds that are in that flock that's moving with this pen. And so in this case, this hypothetical scenario, there's 550 birds per pen. And from that, you can just get at some calculations of, can I close this? Can everybody see the screen, or is my little thing blocking it? Anyway, so.
We can see your screen.
Okay. So if you have a 1,000 square foot pen and you move it 28 times, you've actually covered 28,000 square feet, which is about 60% of an acre. And if you had 550 birds, then you just divide the two, and that would give you 51 square feet of pasture per bird about, which is roughly equivalent to about 854 birds per acre of pasture. So the reason this is important is this is one of the only ways you can standardize how much manure deposition is actually occurring in your field, or get a glimpse or a comparison to how other operations have done it, and whether increasing density might, or decreasing density might be advantageous. And so the real question, though, is what is the best density to raise poultry if you're intending to increase the yield of your crops that follow them? And that's really what our research tried to get at to some degree. And so this project was part of a USDA Organic Research and Extension Initiative. So this work is only being conducted on organic farms, so it may be less relevant to farmers using, for example, synthetic fertilizers. But it can give you some sense. And so some of the people on the call, actually, Victor and Karina Garcia, took part in all this work, as well as Kentima and Julian and Mark Williams at the University of Kentucky that helped make this happen. So what we did is first we introduced 3 poultry treatments in fall of 2020 in these 8x8 poultry pens, and put them on pastures that are 32 by 32 feet. And so basically our treatments were no poultry, 10 broilers per pasture, or 20 broilers per pasture. And so the rates we were really looking at were about 102 square feet of pasture per bird, or 427 birds per acre, and 51 square feet of pasture per bird, or 854 birds per acre. And just to give some perspective, well, first, so these birds were housed here and then would move through the system daily, or sometimes every 2 days, depending on their size and what the conditions. But to give you some perspective about these densities, there are some certification programs out there, like Certified Humane will certify farms pasture raised. And for poultry, that equates to making sure those birds have 108 square feet of pasture per bird. And so really what this means is our low density treatment of 10 birds is roughly equivalent to that density, but our high density is about twice as dense as some of those certified standard pasture raised organizations that are aimed more at animal welfare. Okay, so we set up our experiment, and here it is from outer space or Google Earth. And so we have replicated those treatments 4 times, where we might have a high density, then here's a control treatment with no poultry, and then another pasture with low density, and then we repeat these things 4 times. And so here's another way of looking at it, where we just replicated those experiments. So in fall of 2022, we actually first implemented these poultry treatments. We actually have some background data from before the poultry. We then followed that with a winter cover crop. And then after that, we planted spinach in all of the fields exactly the same, so we could look at what happened to what benefits there were from having these 3 densities. And then we actually repeated this 2 more times in 2021 and 2022, which we're still getting at some of that data. And so what we found for this study was that for spinach yield, following the first year of poultry, we actually found that this higher density poultry treatment at 51 square feet per bird increased yields by about 37% compared to this control treatment where there were no poultry in the field. However, we found that this low density with 102 square feet of pasture per bird didn't really increase yields at all compared to the control. It was actually less than this high density treatment. And so this suggests that actually a higher density for spinach was important. But we also wanted to get at the question of whether this is actually replacing the need for inputs for someone who likely is trying to reduce costs, and is this equivalent to fertilizing these fields? And so we actually in each of these plots introduced different rates of pre-plant fertilizer. So this is where the organic management is relevant, because we used a pre-plant fertilizer, Nature Safe was the product, at a full rate, a half rate, or no fertilizer in different rows or beds within each of those plots. And so this was repeated in each of these fields. And that allowed us to compare the impact of a pre-plant fertilizer to integration. And so what we found for the fertilizer treatments was that actually having a full rate of fertilizer increased spinach yield to about the same extent, but 37% higher than having no fertilizer at all. And the half rate was pretty much right in between. And what's cool about this is it suggests that that high density poultry treatment increased yield to the same extent that this pre-plant fertilizer did. And so basically it suggests you can replace fertilizer with integration to some extent, at least if you're using high density of poultry. And so that followed the second year, we followed that by looking at lettuce, romaine lettuce. This is a winter density variety, and found pretty similar results. The high density treatment increased yield by 42% relative to not having any poultry on there. And the low density was a little bit better than the previous year, but still wasn't really much higher than the control. And the fertilizer treatment actually had a greater impact this time around, where the full rate increased yield compared to no fertilizer by 72%. So in the second year, basically the integration with high density wasn't quite as good as the full rate. It was only about 58% of the effect of having a full rate of pre-plant fertilizer. And so what this data really altogether suggests is that poultry density probably does matter for integration. And I think having a lower density of around 100 square feet of pasture per bird probably is unlikely to consistently increase yields. And for these two crops, at least, we did find that we do see increased yields with a higher density of about 51 square feet per bird. And so I think this is an interesting finding and suggests at a certain density, integration does result in a reduced need for fertilizer inputs, and at least in an organic system, can reduce off-farm inputs. But I think there's also a lot of other considerations to be made here regarding this, and I think we're hoping that we can continue this research because there's a lot more questions. Again, this research was focused on using broilers in hooped pull pens that they were confined to. There could be completely different results based on more of a free-ranging, open roaming type system where the birds are allowed out of the pen, and we may see a much higher variability in the benefits to yield in a system like that, but it would be an interesting study to observe. And then one other really important consideration is there are also other animal welfare concerns to be had, and increasing density too far can result in a lot of other issues if the birds, especially within the confinement of a pen, are increased too much. And so at this density, we were unfortunately unable to do a lot of welfare assessments or behavioral assessments, but we did not see less mortality, and we actually didn't see any difference in weight gain from the different treatments of those birds. And then the last thing is these two crops we studied, spinach and lettuce, are actually short-lived. Longer-lived crops that have longer growing seasons to reach harvest might require more fertility, and therefore integrating might not be enough. And so we think looking at other crops could be very useful in those directions. And so basically, that's our summary here, and I'm sure there's tons of other questions. We have a lot of other things we could talk about with this research, and we're hoping to have many more webinars to discuss this, but we are working on looking at soil health metrics or soil quality metrics in collaboration with folks up at Iowa State. It is to try to understand which changes to the soil structure are really driving these yield benefits we see. We have a lot of data on the food safety of this integration, and be happy to talk about that a little bit. And then we, Karina and Vic, have also been studying the ecological impacts of these poultry on the insect communities, which I think is really fascinating. And then lastly, a collaborator at Iowa State is looking at whether integrating actually results in a more profitable system than versus just growing more vegetables or more poultry itself. Okay, so with that, I'll just thank my lab and the team that worked in the poultry integration project, and be happy to take any questions if people have them, or open it up for discussion.